Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we take your sources and help you unpack the most important insights.
Today we're taking a deep dive into a stack of material you've provided. It's focused on an analysis of conservatism, mainly from excerpts of a book called Conservatives Without Conscience by John W. Dean, published back in 2006.
Yeah, and our mission here is really to explore the key arguments, the psychological stuff, the history references, and the specific examples that are discussed in this text.
Exactly. We want to give you a clearer picture of the perspectives it contains, just remembering everything we discuss is coming directly from the source material you shared with us.
Okay, sounds good. Let's unpack this and see what interesting nuggets we can find.
All right, so kicking things off with the source material itself. The core text is, like you said, those excerpts from John Dean's book from '06.
Right, and it's important to note the source points out the book isn't just Dean's ideas alone. He brings in other sources too.
Yeah, things like a chart from a textbook, The Challenge of Democracy, and various psychological studies. He weaves them into his analysis.
Interesting. So the text starts with a bit of the author's personal context.
It does, and right near the beginning, it gets into clarifying some details about that silent coup book controversy. You know, the one involving Mike Wallace and 60 Minutes.
Oh yeah, Dean mentions Wallace calling in to correct G. Gordon Liddy, I think.
That's right. Wallace apparently noted that 60 Minutes didn't run a piece on that book because, well, they couldn't sufficiently source its claims, according to Dean's account here.
And the source suggests the creators of that book were maybe in it for the money.
That's the claim Dean makes, yeah.
Huh.
And that they fought to save face when people questioned their story.
It also offers a kind of psychological take on why some people might have latched onto that book.
Right, suggesting it maybe served as an outlet for aggression for some folks, or perhaps brought new friends and attention to others. That's the perspective presented.
Okay, so moving from that intro stuff into the historical perspectives on conservatism, as laid out in this source, Dean brings up George Will.
Yes, the conservative columnist. Dean highlights Will's point about the NSA domestic surveillance authorization.
Will saw that as going against a statute, right?
Yeah.
And Dean presents this as Will, thinking some conservatives had sort of forgotten their roots.
Exactly. According to Dean, Will argued from a conservative standpoint, looking back at history. He said modern American conservatism really grew up reacting against the growth of executive power, under FDR and LBJ with the New Deal and Great Society.
And there's that quote in there from de Gaulle about genius knowing when to stop.
Yeah, Dean applies that to the scope of executive power. He also mentions James Burnham and Henri de Riencourt.
Back in the 50s.
Yeah, 1957. The source says they were already worried the presidency was getting too powerful, like Caesarian magnitude.
Wow. And Burnham warned conservatives specifically.
According to the text, yes. He urged them to resist that kind of power concentration, to avoid, well, what he saw as potential despotism, drawing parallels to figures like Napoleon, Mussolini, Hitler. Quite strong warnings presented there.
Then the source shifts to the American founding documents, and Dean makes this claim that the Declaration of Independence was actually troublesome for early conservatives.
Yeah, that's a pretty striking claim. The text then details a specific conservative approach it says they took, basically reinterpreting the Declaration and Constitution to make them seem, compatible.
How so?
Well, by arguing that all men are created equal just meant equality under the law.
Yeah.
It explicitly didn't mean, in this view, a broader kind of egalitarianism or even the pursuit of happiness as a core goal.
Huh. So the source concludes they wanted to sort of neutralize the Declaration's more radical, or as it says, liberal rhetorical potential.
That's the argument presented, and it frames this opposition to broader equality as a key difference between conservatives and liberals, according to Dean's analysis.
But the source mentions there wasn't total agreement within conservatism on this.
Right. It brings up Harry Jaffe's opposing view from 1965. Jaffe, described as a respected Lincoln scholar in the text,
Okay.
he argued that equality was fundamental, but he meant political equality, the idea that no one's born to rule anyone else. Government gets power from consent.
And Jaffe thought the founders did stick to the Declaration when writing the Constitution.
According to Dean, yes. Jaffe had no doubt about that.
Yeah.
So a real split in interpretation presented right there in the source.
All right, so after history, the sources jump into like different types or factions within conservatism and then into psychology.
Yeah, it lists several typologies mentioned in conservative circles at the time. You've got sociocons using secular arguments for social issues.
Okay.
Theocons wanting more theological or biblical law application. Republicans described as young college activists. Catocons, seen as libertarian policy types, and Platocons, followers of Leo Strauss.
Quite a list. And there's polling data in there, too.
Yes. Dean cites national exit polls, averaged from 76 to 2004. It shows conservatives at about 33%, moderates 47%, and liberals 20%.
So moderates being the largest group in that time frame?
According to that data, yes. And a TLAPP poll is also mentioned. It found social conservatives, 52%, and fiscal conservatives, 49%, were the biggest groups among self-identified conservatives. Neocons were lower, at 13%. And Dean notes there's overlap, of course.
Based on that, the source makes this interesting claim that conservatives maybe attack liberals more than the numbers warrant, since liberals are shown as a smaller bloc, like 18% in a Harris poll, 20% in TIPP.
That's Dean's argument. He suggests maybe it's about rallying the base or finding that outlet for aggression mentioned earlier. And this is where it starts to lean heavily into the psychology.
Okay, this is the Joe study part.
Exactly. Political conservatism as motivated social cognition. Dean presents the study's findings as showing conservatives have a heightened psychological need to manage uncertainty and threat.
And that need is linked to what exactly?
According to Dean's reading of the study, factors like fear, not liking ambiguity, needing certainty and structure, maybe overreacting to threats, and a disposition towards dominance.
But the source includes the researcher's response too, right? They didn't say it was pathological.
Critically, yes. Dean includes their clarification that they did not intend to imply conservatism was abnormal, pathological, or the result of mental illness.
Okay, that's important context.
Definitely. But Jost and his colleagues did acknowledge, as cited by Dean, that their findings might not be welcome news, especially regarding how things like threat and death anxiety might influence political preferences, making those clear good versus evil messages more appealing, perhaps.
So, building on that psychological angle, the sources really lean into the work of Bob Altemeyer, discussing what Dean calls authoritarian personalities.
Yeah, and the source makes a really key distinction right away. It separates the political science meaning of authoritarianism, like a type of government, from the psychological use.
Which is about individual thinking and behavior.
Exactly. And Dean's point, as presented, is that these psychological authoritarian personalities can actually push a democracy towards political authoritarianism.
Okay, so what are Altemeyer's categories as described here?
First, you have right-wing authoritarians, or RWAs. Dean presents these more as followers. They see the world as dangerous. They're very submissive to authorities they see as legitimate. They can be aggressive for their causes, and they're highly conventional.
Got it. Followers. And the other type?
Social dominators, or SDOs. These are framed more as leaders. Dean describes them as seeing the world like a competitive jungle, often men, strongly against equality, wanting personal power.
And the description goes on.
Yeah. Amoral, intimidating, vengeful, exploitive, dishonest, prejudiced, mean-spirited, manipulative, creating false images. It's quite a list of traits presented for this SDO type.
Then there's the double highs. What's that about?
Those are individuals who score high on both RWA and SPO scales. Altemeyer, quoted in the source, calls them particularly scary.
Wait, high follower and high leader, how does that work?
Dean explains the apparent contradiction based on Altemeyer's work. When asked about submission, they interpret it as how others should submit to them. They always see themselves as the ones in charge, basically.
Okay, that clarifies it. What else characterizes them in the source?
They're described as dogmatic, really embracing grand philosophies or creeds.
And Dean uses that game simulation example.
Right, the global change game simulation with students. Dean reports that the double high students quickly took charge.
And the results weren't great.
According to Dean's account, nuclear blackmail, making themselves rich through dubious means, destroying the ozone layer, letting 1.9 billion simulated people starve, sending poor regions down the tubes. Pretty dramatic outcomes described.
Now, the source adds a disclaimer, right? Simulation isn't reality.
Yes, Dean includes that caveat. But he uses it to suggest that this simulation highlights the potentially dangerous natures attributed to double highs in Altemeyer's analysis.
And this ties back to the book's title, Conservatives Without Conscience.
Dean makes that connection explicitly. He suggests many conservatives seem willing to set aside their consciences, in his view, and then poses the question of whether this scary double high group, as described, even possesses one.
Okay, so after laying out this psychological framework, the source applies it to specific figures. J. Edgar Hoover comes up first, described as a classic double high.
Yes, according to Dean's analysis, he details Hoover's actions as presented in the source material, running the FBI like his personal fiefdom, using fear tactics, especially the fear of communism.
Intimidating Congress, presidents using dirt he collected.
That's what Dean alleges. Plus, fostering McCarthyism, trying to influence the Supreme Court by bad-mouthing nominees he didn't like, even rigging parts of the Warren Commission investigation, according to this account.
The source also mentions racism, trying to crush the civil rights movement, targeting MLK.
Right. Training agents in burglary, ghostwriting books like Masters of Deceit that preached fear and offered as solutions. Dean claims conservatives practically worshipped Hoover during his anti-communist peak.
Then there's Phyllis Schlafly. How is she described?
As having a moderately RWA personality, according to Dean. He highlights her miraculous managerial skills, but focuses on her use of what he calls the standard authoritarian ploy, fear against the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA.
What kinds of fear tactics does he mention?
Dean lists claims she made. The ERA would mean denying husbands support, unisex toilets, women being drafted for combat, protecting abortion and gay marriage.
And Dean's take on those claims.
He states directly in the text that they were not true. But he argues her powerful propaganda worked incredibly well, grabbing the attention of many women.
There's a quote from a New Yorker profile.
Yeah, something like, deliberation was no match for diatribe, and logic no equal to contempt. Dean presents her as being ahead of her time in that communication style. He argues her work built this whole anti-feminist, so-called pro-family movement, and a volunteer base still active in social conservative politics.
Okay, next case study. Tom DeLay, presented as a textbook double high.
That's the label Dean applies. He argues DeLay fit those four SDO elements perfectly. Desire to dominate, opposition to equality, wanting personal power, and being amoral.
His management style?
Described as bare-knuckle Machiavellian, using an iron fist. Hence the nicknames. The Hammer, the Exterminator, meanest man in Congress. Dean claims he used both fear and loyalty, mentioning the marble tablets and bullwhips in his office decor as symbols.
The source mentions his religious conversion, too, and his moral stances.
Yes, his conversion in '84 and becoming outspokenly moralistic, blaming school shootings on birth control and evolution, for example.
How does Dean connect him to opposing equality?
But primarily through the Texas redistricting plan, Dean asserts it was a disaster for blacks and Hispanics. He details the money and groups he claims were behind it. TR MPAC, AR MPAC, corporate money despite Texas law, funds from the Choctaw tribe.
And the K-Street Project comes up.
Right. Dean claims DeLay, along with Santorum and Boner, monitored lobbying firms, with Grover Norquist involved. Norquist is quoted in the source saying, "We don't want non-ideological people. We want conservative Republicans on K Street." Dean uses this to show a push for ideological purity and control. Dean makes some strong allegations against DeLay pay-to-play lawmaking, flagrant abuses of power, keeping a little black book of contributions.
And DeLay himself confirmed part of that.
Dean cites DeLay, telling a reporter explicitly he wouldn't meet with lobbyists not on his team. Dean argues DeLay's indictment, combined with Jack Abramoff's guilty plea, forced Republicans vying for his leadership spot to promise they'd lighten up on K Street.
Which brings us to Jack Abramoff himself, another poster boy in this analysis.
Yes, Dean labels him another poster boy for double-high authoritarian conservatism. He goes back to Abramoff's early days with Grover Norquist and college Republicans.
Using his own money to win an election.
Yeah, $10 according to the source. And then allegedly reneging on a deal, saying he'd had his fingers crossed. Norquist is quoted again here, advising college Republicans that there are no rules in a knife fight. Dean uses this to paint a picture of the political culture.
There's also mention of him being fired from Citizens for America.
Yes, for alleged mismanagement, Dean characterizes as one big party. Norquist was apparently involved there too. Then, the big scandal. The Indian tribe lobbying. Dean's account is scathing. He claims Abramoff only took tribes with casinos, made them hire Mike Scanlon, DeLay's former press secretary.
And they had a kickback scheme.
A 50-50 split on the fees Scanlon charged, Dean alleges. He claims they built tribes out of maybe $66 million while mocking them in private emails as monkeys and morons. Dean's comment on this is blunt. There is nothing kind-hearted about authoritarians, particularly when they're busy manipulating.
The sources also spend time on the religious right and its role in politics. Dean traces the modern movement back to fundamentalists and evangelicals getting politically active again after pulling back post-Scopes trial.
Right, the 1925 trial. And the key issue that got them re-engaged, according to Dean, was under Jimmy Carter. It was a proposed IRS rule about potentially denying tax-exempt status to private Christian schools.
And Tim LaHaye's reaction is mentioned.
Yeah, Dean notes LaHaye's strong reaction and mentions a prayer cited in the source, asking God to get Carter out and replace him with someone who'd uphold traditional moral values.
Their role in Reagan's election is highlighted.
Definitely. Described as working like bees, pouring millions into the effort, Dean emphasizes their significant impact.
And their continued power.
Dean argues they remain a core part of the Republican base. White Protestant evangelicals making up a quarter to a third of the electorate. He cites a Zogby poll finding 58% of Republicans identified as evangelical and points to Bush's high vote shares from this group, 68% in 2000, 78% in 2004.
Where does Dean say their power is most concentrated?
He argues it's particularly strong in the lower parts of the Republican machinery. Things like precincts meetings, local and state party structures, acting as a kind of filter for Republican candidates coming up.
There's a mention of a study suggesting maybe the rank and file are nicer.
Yes, Christian Smith's study. But Dean expresses skepticism in the book about whether the sample was truly representative. He states he prefers the perspectives of others, like Mark Knoll, Cal Thomas, and even former President Jimmy Carter on this.
And Carter's critique is detailed.
Yeah, Dean outlines Carter's concerns. Inappropriate mixing of politics and religion, current leaders focusing on divisive issues, abortion, death penalty, science versus religion, women's rights, separation of church-state, homosexuality. Carter's quoted saying fundamentalists turn nuance and subtleties into rigid black and white positions, adopting narrow beliefs as a political party's rigid agenda.
And former Senator Danforth echoes some of that, even as a minister and Republican.
Exactly. Dean presents Danforth critiquing Christian conservatives, especially their push for federal action in the Terry Schiavo case. Danforth felt that went against letting suffering end naturally. Dean notes Danforth's view is that conservative Christians had crossed the line. Okay, shifting gears slightly, the sources also look at the judiciary and power dynamics there. Dean starts by describing the federal judiciary itself as basically authoritarian by constitutional design.
How so?
Well, just in the structure, lower courts have to follow the rulings of higher courts. It's hierarchical.
And his main point regarding the Supreme Court
is that just 5 conservatives on the court, holding that majority, can make the law of the land. Their decisions bind everyone below them in the federal system.
And Dean claims President Bush leveraged this.
He argues Bush won crucial social conservative support by promising justices in the mold of Scalia and Thomas. And then, Dean says, he delivered with Roberts and Alito.
The source argues pretty strongly that ideology matters in judging.
Very much so. Dean contends you can often predict rulings based on a judge's party affiliation, which, in his view, means a partisan judiciary does not deliver justice. He frames the conservative-Republican effort here as authoritarians packing the federal courts.
Interestingly, the source then takes on some historical examples that Dean says others use to justify presidents defying the Supreme Court. Like Chuck Colson, maybe?
Colson's mentioned in this section, yeah. Dean sets out to debunk these examples. First, the one about Jefferson and an Alien Imposition Act.
Which didn't exist.
Right. Dean clarifies it was likely the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798. Adams prosecuted under it, Jefferson opposed it, but it expired before Jefferson took office. Crucially, Dean says there was no court order Jefferson defied.
What about Andrew Jackson and the bank?
Dean argues Jackson vetoed the bank's free charter based on his own constitutional view, which Marshall had rejected. But Dean stresses this wasn't defying a court order. The court hadn't mandated the bank's existence or recharter.
And the Lincoln Dred Scott example.
Dean corrects the narrative that Lincoln asked Congress to overrule the court, and that the court then reversed Dred Scott. He says Lincoln argued against the ruling politically and wanted it reversed, sure. But the only real defiance Dean acknowledges was Lincoln suspending habeas corpus during wartime. And reversing Dred Scott took the 13th and 14th Amendments, which Dean says Lincoln didn't specifically request in the way claimed. Now, a really big theme that runs through a lot of this analysis in the sources is what Dean labels the politics of fear.
Right. He links its rise in the executive branch partly to Dick Cheney becoming vice president and, of course, the impact of 9/11.
He claims that making Americans fearful became a standard ploy for the Bush-Cheney administration, adding this fear factor not just to war policy, but tax cuts, Social Security ideas, healthcare.
So it started with 9/11, but then got applied more broadly, in Dean's view.
That's the argument.
Yeah.
That they politically exploited 9/11 and made terrorism the absolute centerpiece.
But the source mentions critics who said the Iraq War actually increased the terror threat.
Yes. Dean cites critiques from people like Senator McCain and Brent Scowcroft, who advised Bush Sr. They argued the war created an incubator or breeding ground, essentially feeding terrorism, the opposite of the administration's claims.
Karl Rove gets mentioned here too, described with that right-wing authoritarian label again.
Yes, Dean links Rove to using fear for political advantage, citing reports that Rove claimed the 2006 midterms would hinge on fear of terrorism.
But the source suggests not that many people are truly scared of terrorism.
Dean makes that point that relatively few are genuinely intimidated. But, he argues, those who are become politically valuable to leaders like Bush and Cheney.
And this ties back to the Jost psychological study again.
Right. Dean suggests the fear of terrorism acts as a useful recruiting tool for Republicans, based on that study's findings. It makes people cling to cultural touchstones, including the president, which helps politically. He points to polling showing Bush more trusted on terror than Kerry, potentially boosting his 2004 vote margin.
And there's that really stark quote from Altmaier presented near the end of this section.
Yeah, it's quite something. Dean quotes Altmaier, suggesting 20–25% of Americans are so right-wing authoritarian, so scared, so self-righteous, so ill-informed, and so dogmatic that nothing you can say or do will change their minds.
And this group is willing to. What?
Altmaier, as quoted by Dean, says they'd be willing to march America into a dictatorship. Dean adds they're described as more politically active, having an old-time religion crusade mentality, very submissive to leaders, and willing to believe and do virtually anything they are told. Heavy stuff presented there.
Okay, the sources continue with power dynamics, focusing again on individuals. Dick Cheney comes up again, presented by Dean as another double high example.
Yes, and Dean associates him directly with bad judgment and developing policies he describes as horrible and in some cases actually evil.
Like detaining enemy combatants without due process, torture, NSA surveillance.
Those are the specific examples Dean lists. He also includes that quote from Colin Powell's former aide, Lawrence Wilkinson.
The one questioning if Cheney really believed the Iraq intel.
Yeah, basically asking if Cheney was mistaken about Iraq being a terror hub before the invasion, or if he was, in Wilkinson's very blunt words cited by Dean, a moron, an idiot, or a nefarious bastard.
Cheney's own views on presidential power are discussed.
Dean presents Cheney's view that the limits put on the presidency after Watergate were misguided, that they hindered unimpaired executive authority.
But Dean adds a critique.
Yeah, Dean notes that, in his view, Cheney never really explained why that authority was needed or addressed the original point of the limits preventing another Vietnam or Watergate. Dean also describes Cheney's communication style as pontificating or dictating, rarely being challenged.
The filibuster also gets a detailed look in the source material. Its history, the nuclear option.
Right. Dean explains the old 23 cloture rule from 1917, meant to stop a small minority blocking the majority's will, but rarely used at first.
He even mentions Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
Yeah, suggesting the movie's heroic portrayal actually made the public less keen on using cloture to stop filibusters.
Then the focus shifts to its use against civil rights.
Dean details how Southern senators used it heavily to block civil rights bills in the 50s and 60s. The massive 74-day filibuster against the 1964 Civil Rights Act is highlighted as leading to rule changes under Senator Mansfield. Then, Dean explains how Democrats started using filibusters against George W. Bush's judicial nominees after Republicans took the Senate in 2002.
And Dean frames this as an effort to stop the courts being packed with right-wing judges.
That's his perspective. He contrasts it with the Republican reaction, saying they wouldn't see it as fair play. Even though, Dean argues, Republicans had previously blocked many Clinton nominees just by refusing to even process them.
Which leads to the nuclear option discussion.
Exactly. The threat by Republicans to change Senate rules with a simple majority vote just to get judicial nominees through without facing a filibuster.
Bill Frist comes into the picture here, presented as a social dominator example.
Yes. Dean brings in childhood accounts described in the source material, painting Frist as a demanding little tyrant, wanting control, king of the hill type.
And his medical school ambition.
Described with phrases like raw, almost insane ambition.
The cat experiment's controversy is detailed.
Dean discusses it quite a bit, framing it as, first, manipulating to succeed. He characterizes the experiments, based on the reporting he cites, as cruel, dishonest, possibly illegal, and something his Senate campaign saw as a potential liability, a bullet they had dodged. Dean also offers his assessment of Frist's political standing at the time the book was written, calls him maybe the weakest majority leader in perhaps 50 years, gives him poor odds for a presidential run, and argues Frist really hurt his image as a clear-thinking doctor by getting involved in the Terry Schiavo case.
Specifically by contradicting the medical consensus based on videos.
Right. Dean points out Frist claimed she wasn't in a vegetative state from watching videos, going against medical reports, and the later autopsy. This, despite Frist apparently having earlier argued against federal intervention in such cases, Dean presents it as pandering to the religious right. Okay, so pulling all of this together, what the sources you provided essentially do is connect these specific psychological profiles, RWA, SDO, double high, to certain political actions and viewpoints that Dean identifies as conservative within the context of his book.
Right, and all those figures we discussed, Hoover, Schlafly, DeLay, Abramoff, Friss, Cheney, they're all analyzed through that specific psychological lens. Their actions, their personalities, interpreted using those frameworks presented in the source.
Yeah, and the recurring themes Dean highlights throughout the text are things like attempts to rewrite history, opposition to certain concepts of equality, leveraging religious groups for political power, trying to control institutions like the courts, and definitely the heavy use of fear as a tactic.
Yeah.
All as described and analyzed by Dean in this source.
And it really is crucial to keep saying this entire discussion has been an exploration of the perspectives and the information presented specifically in the source material you gave us. We're unpacking the arguments made by the author of these texts.
Okay, so wrapping up,
Right.
what's the takeaway here? Based only on these sources and our deep dive into them.
Well, we've covered a lot. We've looked at the complex picture of conservatism painted within these specific texts. We've examined the historical takes, the psychological profiles Dean uses, the specific political figures he analyzes, and tactics like using fear or trying to control the judiciary, all presented through the very particular lens of your source material.
It's really a detailed look at how this author analyzes certain political behaviors and belief systems,
Yeah.
drawing on the specific studies and examples he chooses to present his case.
And understanding different viewpoints and the arguments marshaled within various texts, even ones you might disagree with, is just so important for being well-informed on complex subjects. Absolutely. So, here's maybe a final thought, something to consider based purely on the ideas raised in these sources. Think about that central psychological argument presented here. The idea that specific personality types might significantly shape the direction and the methods of political movements. If you take that idea seriously, just based on the points made in this text, what implications could that have for how someone might analyze political leadership, or even the potential future path of democracy?
Definitely something to chew on.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for providing these sources and letting us take this deep dive with you today.